Yeah, coconut oil. That's it. A clinical assessment is a collecting of relevant information about the client in an effort to reach a conclusion about their problem. You got to get information from someplace. Psychodynamic therapists listen to their clients speak freely in a process called free association to gain insight into their problem, and that's psychodynamic therapists. These psychoanalysts believe that abnormal behavior is caused by childhood traumas that are buried deeply into the unconscious. The therapist is only allowed glimpses with free association and possibly in a dream with dream analysis. And one of you were talking about doing a research looking at dream analysis, and I think that'd be a really good idea. We need to understand why in the world people dream and where they come from, and whether that it has anything to do with anything, or is it like watching Disney on television or something? I don't know. The interview is the basic, often the only instrument of assessment, because the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 are based largely on a person's self-report. So we need to understand what's going on with this individual. Well, how do you find that out? You interview them, you talk to them, you ask them pertinent questions. And this is known as the interview. The general goals include establishing rapport with the client, decreasing the client's anxiety about the process, and collecting some basic details. Formal structured clinical interviews are standardized interviews in which the diagnostician asks specific questions tied to DSM categorization. Those of you who have been in 291, Site 291, there is a historical form that you have to, there's a form that you have to fill out in 291, and it has to do with a standardized interview form. So if you haven't been in 291, don't worry about it, but one of the things that you will do in 291 is to look at that form. You'll see what the form looks like. The interviewer relies heavily on accuracy of the person's self-report. You have to remember that some people are liars. Some people are really good liars. The DSM-5 has several different groups of individuals that are some of the best liars in the world. Somebody with antisocial personality disorder, he's a pathological liar. Somebody who's an alcoholic, how do they get to drink all the time? They lie, they create chaos. And the reason that they do that is so that they can continue drinking. Okay, so this whole idea of interviewing people and finding out good information, this works almost exclusively, but not with everyone. So you have to remember that there are liars out there. I know I was shocked when I found out too, that people would lie to me. They lie to me. Why would they do that? A lot of it has to do with, there are various circumstances can affect what a patient tells an interviewer, the skill of the interviewer, of course, asking the right questions, personal characteristics of the patient. Of course, this also includes the lying part. Oh, I got good news for you, or maybe this is bad news. The autopsy results from the shooter in Las Vegas came out over the weekend, and guess what they discovered from his autopsy? We're wondering why this guy shot 59 people and injured 800.
He was on medication?
He was on anti-anxiety medication, which should lessen the probability that he's going to do something like that. Okay. He was on that was the only medication he was on. What do you think? Brain tumor? His brain was too small? What's going on? Nothing. Nothing. They found absolutely nothing. This man is perfectly healthy. He was 6'1", he weighed 224 pounds. There's nothing wrong with it. Isn't this scary? Now maybe we have to come up with a new category. Maybe we have to come up with a new problem. Why in the world would somebody decide to do that? This has got to be abnormal, right? Let's not call it normal, all right? Otherwise, we're going to have all the concerts in the United States, somebody's going to start shooting. And it could happen. We could get a copycat shooter. Wow, this is nutty. So we don't know what his problem was. But obviously it's abnormal. Please, let's make this abnormal. Do you think of any instance where killing 59 people innocent people would be normal. I can't either. It just isn't there. I'm sorry, it's just not there. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. If we could have interviewed him, and he had been interviewed several times prior to the shooting. He had been interviewed by a psychologist, he'd been interviewed by lawyers, mostly because he was angry about something. He was suing somebody. He tripped and fell down in Las Vegas at one of the casinos, and he was trying to sue them. And for that reason, they interviewed him. Nothing came out. There's nothing in the interviews. He wrote nothing down. There's no manifesto. There's no suicide note. Nothing. So now we have to come up with a reason why somebody would shoot 59 people and injure 800. That's a real big number, 800 people. Some of them were wounded. Some of them were injured trying to flee. He had them trapped. There were only two ways to get out, and he had both of those exits under fire. So what do? You just sit there and wait to be shot? Not normal. Personal characteristics of the patient, and we're not exactly sure what's going on with this guy. The immediate circumstances and purposes of the interview, and those have to do with the information that we're getting. Cultural factors can influence the interview process. When the interviewer and the client are of different ages, genders, and/or ethnic origins, bias and misinterpretation of self-reports are common outcomes. I was watching a movie the other day, and they used the word hookup. This is a movie made in 2009, and they used the word hookup. So what does hookup mean?
Get together?
Okay. Come on, what does hookup mean?
Interact. Get services?
I don't know, what if we ask a young person what hookup means, what are they going to tell us?
To make it yeah.
I'm sorry?
Being intimate.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. Being intimate. Yeah, it's usually
Be
like
intimate.
intimate.
Be intimate, that's a nice way of saying having sex. Thank you. Okay. Yes, that's exactly what it means. But did they mean that in this movie? Because
What was the context?
this is the context. It's a great movie. I watched it like a dozen times. The movie's called I Love You, Beth Cooper, if you've ever seen the movie. It's a coming-of-age movie. It's kind of stupid, but at one point, she can't buy beer because she doesn't have an ID. She's not 21. She can't buy beer, so she says, I'm going to kiss you so hard that every time you think about it, you'll have to change your underwear. That's what she says. And so when they go out to she gets the beer, of course. And we don't get to see the kiss, which is disappointing. But other than that, I mean, that's a but when she goes out to the car, the hero, and I can't remember what his name is, some nerdy guy, he says, you didn't have to hook up to get beer. That's what he says. You didn't have to hook up to get beer. So, I guess it was kind of an intimate kiss. I'm guessing it was an intimate kiss. But I mean, they used it in two different contexts. And I'm pretty sure they didn't have sex at the grocery store. I mean, there was the clerk at the convenience store. I'm pretty sure they didn't have sex, but they just kissed each other. Or she just kissed him really good, I guess. The term was hook up. So, the problem is, so somebody says hook up, and if they're like over 80, you're assuming that they're not talking. They used to talk about make love. If you watch an old movie from the 1940s or 1950s, they would talk about making love. It doesn't have anything to do with being intimate. It has to do with flirting. So make love for somebody that is in their 80s or 90s means, watch old movies sometimes. They use all kinds of interesting terms. There's a movie called Bringing Up Baby, where it's got Cary Grant. It's got Cary Grant in it, and at one point, this lady asks him what he's doing there, and he said, I just all of a sudden became gay all of a sudden. And then he dances and he's wearing this frilly outfit. What is he talking about? Is he happy? He's talking about happy. Sure. So words change, their meanings change, depending on who you are and where you are, and how you interpret hookup, I guess. Anyway, yes, being intimate is the new term for hookup. That's what hookup means. I guess on Facebook, you talk about hooking up on Facebook. You don't talk about that. Anyway, okay, so it all depends on how old the individual is. If you're talking to somebody from another culture, potentially they use terms differently than you do. Okay. There is considerable variation between cultures in how psychological distress is described. Asians, for example, they want you to, Asians want you to tell them what their problem is and fix it, and tell them how to fix it. That's the way Asians do things. They want you to do that. But if you're talking to somebody of European descent, they go to see psychologists all the time. As a matter of fact, that's what it started over in Europe. So it really all depends on the culture as to how they're going to react to mental illness or mental health. Asians, of course, they don't want to talk to you. They want to tell you what their problem is, and then they want you to tell them how to fix it, and they want you to fix it tomorrow. Not after 15 episodes of us talking to each other, because I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not going to tell you what my problem is, I want you to fix it right now. And that's the way they deal with things. So different cultures deal with things differently. There are forms of psychological problems that are highly specific to certain cultural groups, culture-bound syndromes. We're going to talk about some of the culture-bound syndromes right now. The number one mental illness in Japan is a mental illness called Taijin Kaiufusho. It afflicts 7 to 36% of the population. That's a hell of a lot of people if you think about it. This ailment is a social phobia where the individual is afraid to go out into public for fear of embarrassing themselves or offending others. These individuals have a deep fear of mumbling out loud and inadvertently offending someone. In other words, talking to themselves and saying something like, Chris is an asshole, everybody knows that. Oh my God, did you hear that? Did I say that out loud, Chris? I'm sorry. Chris is really a nice guy. I was just using him as an example. The Japanese are very polite and very sensitive to shame. So for this reason, they're afraid of passing gas. They're afraid of offending someone in one way or another, or saying something that would be offensive. Does all that make sense? Taijin Kaiofusho afflicts 7 to 36% of the population in Japan. As interesting as that is. And of course, if you've ever been in Japan, it's very crowded, and you've got people all around you, and you can't, okay. And those of you who've heard my story about the Japanese stewardesses, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. I'm not going to tell it again. It's a little embarrassing. Amok is a disorder of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Puerto Rico. It is characterized by a sudden unexplained rage and violence where the individual might injure or kill somebody. They just get so pissed off that they kill somebody. This is similar to the Viking frenzy of battle that they refer to as berserk. They would start fighting, they get a bloodlust, and they would just kill everybody, kill anybody that they came across. And of course, you're going, oh my God, it's a good thing he's on my side. Because otherwise he'd be chopping me into pieces. The individual may return to normal after the episode is done, and of course they black out during the whole series. Cultural syndrome. We don't have that in the United States, but they do in the Philippines. Attack of nervois, de nervois. Attack of the nerves occurs in Latin America and in Mediterranean cultures. It is characterized by uncontrollable fits of crying, trembling, and aggressive verbal and physical behavior. The individual may have amnesia after the episode. In other words, they go off on somebody and then they can't remember that they did it. Attack of the nerves. Dot syndrome is a problem found among men from rural India. These men will forego sleep for fear of having a nocturnal emission, in other words, losing some of their semen. They hold their urine for fear of losing semen with their water and limit their ejaculations. They think that they only have a select amount of semen in their lifetime, and if they use it up this way, then they won't have it to use in another way. Okay. And they also feel that semen gives them energy. Dot. Okay, so this is people from India. Whoops, jump, let's see here. Blacking out is an affliction that occurs among people in the southern United States and the Caribbean. The individual loses the ability to move, but often can hear what is going on around them. This episode may be preceded by a dizzy feeling, and then they black out, and then they regain consciousness again. They just black out, as bizarre as that seems. Koro is a problem seen in China and South and East Asia. It afflicts both men and women. It is a fear that one's genitals will shrink, retract into the body, and cause death. So, I know, it's really kind of interesting. I know. When we talk about the Japanese, we have to understand that the Japanese do things a lot differently than we do in the United States. So their culture is, and a lot of this has to do with sex, and I apologize for that, but they just have different sexual practices than we have in the United States. It ain't the same. Zara is a problem that people in North Africa and the Middle East may have. They feel that they are possessed by a spirit that makes them act erratically. They may seem apathetic toward their own survival, and for this reason they have to chain them to things. This is an individual, as you can see, they're chained to this cement post because she has Zar, or he, I'm not exactly sure if it's a male or a female. Frigiophobia is a morbid fear of catching cold or being cold. It has been primarily identified in China and Taiwan. Actually, northern China is relatively cold, but southern China is fairly tropical. Taiwan, of course, is an island in the Pacific Ocean, and it is relatively warm there. This problem leads people to dress themselves in heavy scarves and coats, even in the summertime. Males see being cold as a female attribute and are afraid of losing their masculinity because they get cold. So they never talk about being cold. If you're a male, you never talk about being cold because that's just too effeminate. So you can't do that. I know, it's very, very different society. Susto is a condition peculiar to Latin America where people feel that a frightening experience has caused their soul to dislodge from their bodies and they are living other people's traumas. So if you suffer from susto, if somebody else has a trauma, potentially you will live that trauma with them. Okay. Symptoms of susto include nervousness, anorexia because you can't eat, you're living other people's traumas, insomnia, listlessness, fever, depression, and diarrhea. I was reading an article about culture-bound syndromes among American Indians, and they said this is also true of some American Indian groups. I don't know if it's this group, but susto. It was written by, the article was written by a guy at Northern Arizona University, so I don't know. I've never heard, nobody's talked about this to me, but he was saying that there are groups that feel like their souls have been dislodged and they are living somebody else's traumas. Voodoo death is found largely in Africa. It is a condition in which people are convinced that a curse has been put on them or that they have broken a taboo. Their fear reaction can sometimes lead to uncontrolled sickness and death, or death, and death, with death. Anyway, voodoo. Voodoo, that's a culture-based syndrome as well. Lata is common in Southeast Asia, Siberia, and among the Ainu of Japan. The Ainu are the people that were on Japan before the Japanese got there. Yeah. They're not really Caucasian. They're just paler than the Japanese are. They're relatively white. Did you ever meet any Ainu?
No, we did study their culture, but yeah.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
I know, you go to Japan and you even mention the word Ainu. It's like you just said something we weren't supposed to talk about. Yeah, I know. It's really bizarre. Japanese are interesting people. Anyway, and I mentioned Ainu way too many times while I was over there, so I got in trouble a lot. These individuals fall into a trance-like state after they have been startled, such as being tickled or seeing a snake. They may bark, scream, sexually charged statements, or act in a culturally inappropriate manner, and that is known as law talk. Anyway, Malgry is a syndrome of territorial anxiety identified in Australian Aborigines. Symptoms include headache, abdominal pain, and bloating, and often pain in lower extremities too, sometimes vomiting. Local explanation, it is caused by eating terrestrial food and then going into seawater without washing in fresh water, or eating seafood and then going ashore without washing in salt water. But only if you are not in your own totem zone, so the local spirit does not recognize you. In other words, it's a local spirit. You have a totem zone. This is the Aborigines of Australia. Everybody has a totem zone, and the local spirits are watching over that totem zone. And if you're not from that totem zone, you may eat things incorrectly. You ate things in the wrong order or something. So that's the problem, as odd as it may seem. Agonius is seen in Portugal and the Azores. Does anybody know what the Azores are? They're islands off the Portuguese shore. They're out in the middle of the Atlantic, but they belong to Portugal. Tenerife is one of the Azores. Lagos is one of the Azores. We have an Air Force base, or we used to have an Air Force base there. This syndrome has been identified as an anxiety disorder that involves feeling that there's a physical reaction to a spiritual loss of where they live. In other words, they have to live in the same place all their lives. And if they leave, then they feel the spiritual loss of where they used to live. Symptoms include a constant burning sensation, loss of breath, hysterical blindness, sleeping, and anorexia. You can't eat because you're not in the place where you're supposed to be. You're not living where you were born, I guess. Kufunga Sisa is a Zimbabwean Shona word that translates as thinking too much. It is mental exhaustion from dealing with problems, thus they become non-functional. This problem is found throughout Africa, the Caribbean, and in East Asia. So people think too much. So don't think too much or you'll get Kufunga Sisa. All right. Culture-bound syndromes. The Inuit of Greenland suffer from a problem known as kayak angst. They experience a feeling of panic while out on the ocean, hunting seals. The individual, of course, must ground themselves. They have to find ground until the panic subsides because they think they're about to drown. So, I don't know. Look at the size of that kayak. You're out in the middle of the ocean. You got all these waves moving you up and down. I don't know. Just thinking about it, I get kayak angst. Ghost sickness is found among many tribes. It's called Piblo Tok among the Arctic and the subarctic Inuit. It's called Icha-a, which means moth madness in Navajo. It's similar to being a moth. It is also seen among the Mojave and the Apache of the Southwest, ghost sickness. And this is a ghost sickness ceremony, trying to cure somebody of ghost sickness. A form of depression exists among several indigenous people in the Americas, called Wasinko by the Oglala Lakota and Tawadal Yesni by the Dakota. It is also seen among the Mojave, the Hopi, the Navajo, and the Cree and Ojibwe. Navajo syndrome, referred to as crazy or frenzy, is characterized by the sudden onset of a high level of activity such as running, a trance-like state, and potentially dangerous behavior, and that's another culture-bound syndrome. Okay, but that's all the culture-bound syndromes I'm going to talk about. Where did I get all this information? Well, most of that information is in your textbook. Some of that information I got out of the article I was telling you about. It was written by a guy by the name of Timothy Thompson from Northern Arizona University. He was fairly non-specific. I was thinking, you ought to be giving us better stuff than this. in 19 pages. Yeah. Sometimes he would talk about a syndrome, and then in the next paragraph he'd talk about how that syndrome didn't really exist. It was really kind of bizarre. But I read the whole damn thing painfully. Sorry. I don't like to read articles either, just you guys don't have to read them. Anyway, okay. So, observation is concerned with what persons do rather than what they say they do. So if you observe somebody, you know whether they actually do it or not. One of the things that you're going to run into, I talk about this in 291, but one of the things you're going to run into is that individuals lie to you. I know. They may dress differently than they normally dress, so you have no idea who this person is. All you know is that that person that came in looks like they look. Is this the person that they all are all the time? Is this the way they act when they're at home? And the answer is probably no. So a lot of times they're like you. Yes, sir.
Just back to the previous slide. Who did you say wrote that thing about my mom?
Timothy Thompson. He's, what does he have? He's got an EDD, Doctor of Education.
Did you say he's an
Yeah, he's an okay. I don't know. I wanted to call him up on the phone and ask him, why didn't you say something specific in this article? I mean, he talked about like 15 different problems, and then, you know, like I said, in the next paragraph, he said that they don't exist. Like, well, let me show you this one. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Ghost sickness. You know, he talked about this, and then he said, but there are no confirmed cases of that have ever been seen. Well, why in the world did you even mention it if there are no confirmed cases? You know, this thing about the Inuit in Greenland, I don't know. Moth madness, I've heard of moth madness. I've heard that term before. But of course I don't speak Navajo, so I think it means moth madness, doesn't it? Isn't that what this means?
Yeah.
Yeah, moth madness. Anyway, Timothy Thompson is the guy. Do I believe everything that I read? I rarely believe anything that I read, so I'm not exactly sure. Okay, so we talked about the interview. We talked about observation. Observations made during the interview together with a person's responses to certain types of questions comprise a mental status examination which provides a current picture of the person's level of functioning. Remember, we're going to be observing, when you're interviewing somebody, one of the things you're going to be doing is observing how they act, observing how they say things. And you're going to try to determine what the problem is, what the problem that this guy has. That's what you're going to try to be determining. And this is known as a mental status examination. So if he's saying one thing, I had a friend that I worked with, and if he was in a meeting, he would be sitting in his chair and his foot's just popping up and down. I mean, just popping up and down. Well, what the hell was that all about? If I were interviewing him, I'd say the guy was probably ADHD, and he couldn't control himself. But and he was a little bit ADHD. So the whole time you're observing everything, the way that they say words, the way that they present things, whether they're looking at you when they say something. All of this has to do with the mental status examination. And a lot of times what you see them doing is more important than what they're saying. Because remember, people can lie. It doesn't mean that they're going to lie. It doesn't mean that they have to lie. It just means that sometimes what you see is more important than what they're actually saying. There are psychological tests out there. Most of them are standardized procedures for obtaining a sample of behavior from which inferences can be made about the person's general psychological functioning. Okay, so we have psychological tests. They're usually constructed so that a person's responses can be quantified and compared with norms obtained on a large sample of other individuals. Beck's Depression Inventory is such an instrument. It tells you if the person is depressed. Can they lie on that test? Of course they can. And a lot of times they will. If it's a guy, then probably he will fill out the test as if he isn't depressed at all. If it's a woman, sometimes, especially if she's looking for attention, a lot of times she will answer the questions as if she's highly depressed, just so that somebody will pay attention to her, if that is the situation. So we have to gauge everything as to who the individual is and what's going on in their lives. Common psychological tests used for classification include intelligence tests, personality tests, and neuropsychological tests. And those of you who have answered the question for this chapter, that's what I asked you. Which one is more accurate in this population? Which one of the psychological tests? Intelligence tests such as the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler's intelligence scales for adults and children are especially useful when there is a question of intellectual disability or when, for some other reason, an estimate of the person's general level of intellectual ability is required. This happens a lot. If we have an individual that is not doing very well in their schoolwork, we need to find out if they have the intellectual capacity to be able to do the schoolwork. And of course, at that point, we would give them an IQ test to determine how high their IQ is. If they have a relatively low score, then we know potentially that they have an intellectual disability. An individual's pattern of strengths and weaknesses across various parts of the tests can provide evidence of specific types of learning disorders, developmental disabilities, neurological impairments, and memory problems. And these are intelligence tests. The first type of psychological test we're going to talk about are projective personality tests. The basic assumption in all projective techniques, which are derived from psychodynamic perspective, is that people project their own internal dispositions into their responses to ambiguous stimulus materials. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to see a lot of ambiguous things. We're going to see ink blots. We're going to see pictures. We're going to make them draw us a picture. And this is all ambiguous, relatively ambiguous. There's nothing going on in the picture. There's certainly nothing going on in the ink blot. But sometimes people will project what's going on in their own minds onto what they see. Projective techniques are used mainly in an intuitive and clinical fashion by more psychodynamically oriented therapists. Projective tests are really kind of cool. I don't use them, but they're really kind of cool. I'll show you what I'm talking about in a second. These tests are used primarily by clinicians to assess various aspects of personality, such as characteristic motives, defenses, conflicts, self-image, and thought processes. The two most common types of personality tests are projective tests, or projective techniques, and personality inventories. But we're going to talk about the projective tests first. Projective tests are called projective because the client projects their feelings into the interpretation of what they're looking at. So you show the person a select picture of an ink blot and ask them, what do they see? The oldest test, of course, is the Rorschach. That's the ink blot test. It was developed by a Swiss psychologist by the name of Hermann Rorschach. It's really kind of fascinating. I'll show you some pictures of the ink blots in just a second. Rorschach construed a series of ambiguous ink blots that he asked clients to interpret. He was looking for themes and images in the interpretation. As you will see, the ink blots are just ink blots, okay? Now clinicians tend to look for various contexts, whether they focus on the dark or the light spaces. Do they look at the whole or just parts of the image? Do they ignore the different colors or just the dark areas? Are they just looking at the dark area? And of course, this was developed by a psychodynamic therapist. That was Rorschach. So this is one of the ink blots. Does anybody see anything in there? Don't you see Wile E. Coyote? I see Wile E. Coyote in there.
Now I see him.
Okay, there you go. Wile E. Coyote. Okay. It's like looking at a cloud. Oh, George Washington, look at that. Today's Lincoln's birthday, by the way. It's the 12th of February. Anyway. There's another one. Okay, this is one of the originals. Actually, this may be one that he rejected. Yeah, this is one that he rejected. Okay. So if you can look at that, you could see something. I don't know. Oh, I see a fire.
tricky. Yeah.
There's another one. If you look at that, you see some kind of an insect, or you see a bat or a butterfly, then you're okay. If you look at
I
this,
see a Viking.
if you look at this and you focus on this area and you say, oh, that's a penis right there, and there's the two testicles.
Now it's
Something totally, yeah, exactly, okay. I know. If you, and they give you a series of these things. So if you look at that one and you see sexual parts, and you look at that one and you see sexual parts, well, maybe this person has an obsession for sexual parts. Maybe that's what's going on. That's obviously a bed bug.
But
I don't know. Oh no, more sexual parts. What's going on here? This is terrible. There we go. Okay. And that's the last Rorschach I'm going to show you. And of course, if you see the same thing over and over again, if you keep seeing sexual parts, if you keep seeing dogs, or you keep seeing something, it may be that you're phobic about sexual parts or dogs. Listen.
Do they design these in any way that so that if someone was, say, obsessive about sexual parts, that it would almost come out immediately? Because now that you said it, when I look at it, I was like, I can see
all the sexual parts. Okay.
But I wasn't seeing it before.
Right.
Did they design them like that or
No. No, they're just random ink blots. And there's a series. Now there are about 15 different series that you can show somebody. But none of them have anything specific. Some people see bats, some people see insects, and that's okay, if you're seeing these things. But if you're focusing on, just one chunk over here in the corner, now we've got an obsession taking place. Yes, ma'am.
I think about this projective tests, I worry about dreams.
Dreams?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so you guys interpret dreams, and it's similar to the projective test. Okay, I'm going to show you another projective test.
I took a test like this when I was in the Marines. I applied for an MCU. And this was one of the tests that we had. Went through a whole battery of psychological tests.
Of course you did.
And this other guy, a friend of mine, who had, he kind of scared me. He said, because it cut a lot of people out. So what he told me to do was take it by quarters and then go down like this in order. And then, so you pick something out a little bit
How
different.
did you do it?
I passed.
You passed, okay. So you got embassy duty, even though...
Well, I know I ended
Okay.
up turning it down, but I passed the psychological portion of it.
Okay. Well, congratulations. I congratulate you. If you had said the same thing over and over and over again, they would see it as an obsession. And then you wouldn't have passed. Yeah. Even though there were so many questions, so many pictures to look at. Yeah. Yeah, you have to know what they're looking for. If you saw sexual parts, like, as an example.
Well, I just did something different every time I looked for
Right.
an airplane one time.
There you go.
A type of airplane, and I looked for a household item in the next corner. So I just kept it totally random as I could.
As random, and that's exactly what they're hoping for. This is nothing, okay? This is an ink blot, all right? There's nothing in this picture. So if you're seeing the same thing over and over and over again, obviously you're obsessing about something. And then we got a problem. That's interesting that you've done this. How many pictures did they show you?
I think it was close to, probably around 20. Maybe it might have been a little bit more. It was a long time ago.
Okay. Okay.
It was just part of the whole psychological battery.
They were looking to see if you had an obsession of one kind or another. Fascinating as that is. Okay, so we can look at ink blots if we want. That's Rorschach. The thematic apperception test is also a projected test. The apperception means conscious perception. Thus, as the title of the test indicates, the clinicians are looking for a recurring theme that seemed to be running around in the client's mind. In other words, if you look at all of these pictures and you come up with the same theme over and over and over again, it means that is an obsession with you. That is a problem that you have. The clinicians feel that clients will focus on one character in each of the pictures, and that person will be the individual who is causing them the most trouble. So in most of these pictures, there's a male and a female. And if the person is having problems with their mother, they'll focus on the female. If the person has been sexually molested by their uncle, then they will focus on the male. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking to see who you are talking about. Whether you bring up your uncle, well, you don't really need to bring up the uncle. What you will be doing is focusing on the male figure in the picture. And some of these are fairly ambiguous pictures. Obviously, he's upset and something's going on with her, but is she dead? Is she asleep? That's an awfully short bed. What's he doing? What's he been reading? Is he really crying, or is he just tired? Or is he just doing the dap? Is that what they call it?
Someone turn the light on.
He's
I can't
recording.
see. Okay, that's an older picture. This is a newer picture. So the man is in the foreground and the woman is behind. Looks like she's got a headache. I don't know. Is she in her pajamas? I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Is she coming in from the bedroom? So if you focus on the female, then that means one thing. If you focus on the male, it means something totally different. Chris.
I'm just curious, because this is clearly from a Western diagnosis perspective, but does this work across cultures? Like if you were bringing someone from Africa or Alaska, no matter what, you would still
We've
reveal
got
the same
different
thing?
pictures for different cultures. Wait until you see. I've got different pictures from different cultures. It's great.
But would this work for someone from a whole separate culture? Would it still reveal
Yes and no. If this is obviously from the Western world. It's either from the United States or Europe. Would it work in Africa where they live in shacks? No. No, they couldn't identify with this picture at all. But I do have some pictures from another culture. That's from the Western culture as well. There's only two females in the picture, but one of them seems to be, I don't know what's one of them. It's a very ambiguous question. There's really not a whole lot going on. Here we got the opposite of the first picture. The woman is covering her eyes, and the man is the one in the bed. Is he dead? Is he drunk? Is she upset? Did somebody just turn the light on? I don't know. Okay, this one is from Puerto Rico. This is from Puerto Rico. These other pictures, of course, can they really relate to these pictures? Well, potentially not. So the Puerto Ricans have their own TAT pictures, and this is one of them. For one thing, we see two people in the picture, but there's obviously four people sitting down at this table because there's four different drinks at the table. I know.
Or it's happy hour.
It must be happy hour in Puerto Rico. Here's one from India. And as we can see, this is similar to another picture that we saw, but it's the people are dressed as they do in India. And there's another TAT picture from India. I've got one more. And this one is from Korea. And this one confuses me a great deal because she doesn't have a nose. I don't know what happened to her nose. I used to work with a lady from Korea, and I asked her what this said, and she said, "I'm not going to tell you." So I have no idea what it said. Evidently, she was too embarrassed to tell me what it said. I don't know. She still doesn't have a nose. It doesn't really matter. She doesn't have a nose. He's probably asking her what happened to her nose. The Japanese do this a lot. They draw pictures without noses, especially women don't have noses. Anyway, that's from Korea. Sentence completion test is another projective test. The client is asked to complete a series of ambiguous sentences. Once again, they're looking for a recurring theme and perhaps a focal figure who might be the author of their problems. So if you're having problems with your mother, you might say, "I wish my mother would get off my back." My father is putting up with my mother. I don't know how he does it. My ambition is to get away from my mother. Are you catching a theme here? Women are just like my mother. I'm not going to ever have anything to do with any of them. What worries me is turning out like my mother. My mother is the sweetest person in the entire world. Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense at all. To draw a person, clinicians feel that drawings tell something about their creators. The interpretations involve the looking at the details. What are detailed on these individuals? What are the shapes like in the picture? The solidity of the lines. The location of the drawing on the paper, the sizes of the figures. Is Dad really big and everybody else is really small? This may mean that Dad intimidates everybody. Is Mom the big one in the family? How large are the children, if there are any children in the picture? A lot of times children will feel like they're being ignored. In which case, if they drew a picture of their family, they would either be really tiny or they wouldn't be there at all. And of course, they ask them who each figure in the picture is. The features of the figures: does Dad have a really big face? Does he have pointed teeth? Does he have great big ears like a wolf? These are all things that we're looking at. What kind of a background did they draw? You give them as much time as they want to draw the picture, of course. Comments made by the respondent during the drawing task. And this is really good for children. Having the children draw a picture and then talking about the picture while they're drawing it. A lot of times they can give you all these answers. So you won't have to analyze what's going on. The child has already analyzed it for you. Anyway, and here's a picture, of course. They just asked the kid to draw a picture of his family. And as you can see, Dad's smiling, Mom's laying on the floor with a frown on her face, and here's the kid up here. And I can't read that, but I'm not sure what that says. Anyway, what's in the background? There's 3 people in a couch. What's that all about? Okay, here's another one. As you can see, she's got a cat. I'm guessing she's giving the little boy a flower. He's giving her a flower. It's a pretty happy picture. Here's a creek. Here's a child. There's somebody laying down up here. I don't have the whole picture. Okay, I'm going to show you a series of pictures. This is really kind of interesting. This guy is one of the more famous artists of the 19th and 20th centuries. His name is Edvard Munch. I'm going to show you a series of pictures that he drew. Edvard Munch was born in, he would have been born in Oslo, Norway, except at that time they called the capital Christina, after Queen Christina. Anyway, this is a series of pictures. You probably recognize this picture. It's one of the most famous pictures in the world. It's called The Scream. He's the one that did The Scream. He's the one that drew this picture. He did a lot of art. Some of his art was repetitive, mainly because he would cut wood blocks, and then sometimes he would fashion them as in one color and sometimes in another color. Anyway, I'm going to show you a series of pictures, and this is a picture that he called The Frieze of Life. It starts out with what men think about, and I've got the titles to all these. This is called Men in Their Minds, I think. In the Brain of Man. And as you can see, he's very Freudian. This is the turn of this is at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. The sexual repression was going on. What do men think about? Well, they think of women, of course. What else is there to think about? This one is called Dance of Life. And if you can see this, this is a very young lady, a relatively young lady. You can see the blushes on her cheeks. They've just gotten married. They look like cadavers, don't they? It's pretty nasty. Anyway, and of course, here's the lady. She's in mourning, and she has sunken cheeks. Of course, she looks like she's almost dead as well. This is the Dance of Life. Edvard Munch. Okay, wait a second. I got another one. Okay. This is the first picture in the frieze. This one is man's head entangled in woman's hair. That's the name of this picture. As we can see, the head is almost, well, it's decapitated, obviously. But you can see how large. The important thing is to notice how big his head is, okay? Because we're going to see him again. in just a minute. Okay. So this is the first picture. Man entangled in woman's hair. Man's head entangled in woman's hair. Okay. This one is called Jealousy in the Garden. We see the same head that we saw before, don't we? Yeah, same head. Right. And of course, here she is out in the garden. It looks like her clothes are coming off. That's his imagination. That's his imagination. Don't get too excited. Anyway, Jealousy in the Garden. And this one is just called Jealousy. So whereas before she was just talking to the guy, now all of a sudden she's kissing the guy. And that's jealousy again. Interesting the way he uses color. His face is a little bit different. Okay. He painted this one originally, it wasn't in the frieze, and then he put it in the frieze. This one initially he called Love and Pain, but now it's called The Vampire. Popularly, people started calling it The Vampire. And as you can see, we've got the same red-headed woman. We've got him all curled up, and she's biting the back of his neck. He looks almost dead, as you can see, as interesting as that is. It gets better. Or maybe it gets worse. Oops, I went the wrong direction. Sorry. Okay. This one's called Ashes. And as we can see, he's in exactly the same position he was in before. And this one's called Ashes. I was reading a description of this. I'd never even thought about it before. But of course, they're out in the middle of nowhere. And potentially they've had sex. And so if they've had sex, why in the world is he curled up like this? Why is he all green? And of course she's standing up there, dominant with her red hair, her red tangled hair. Okay. He's going to get smaller. This is called the 3 stages of woman. This is her when she's young. This is her when she's the sexual animal. And this is her as she's getting older. And there's his head right there in her hands. You know, another decapitated head. It gets better. Are you ready? For the last picture. Okay. Now this guy's obviously had problems with women. Okay. Yeah. Evidently his girlfriend. He was never married, by the way. Really kind of curious. He's obviously had trouble with women, and he paints all these problems that he's having with women. So the last one is called Madonna. Are you ready for Madonna? Are you sure? This is Madonna. As you can see, she's obviously a sexual being. This is him down in the corner. He has become a fetal figure. With each picture, he's shrinking smaller and smaller and smaller. Initially, his head is the same size as hers. Then all of a sudden, he just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Starts having problems with women, of course. And this is how women dominate his life. And he's down here in the corner. A fetal figure in the very corner. And this is known as the freeze of life. And unfortunately, obviously, he's had problems with women. Okay, so of course, you won't expect a child to draw these pictures, or even an adult to be able to draw pictures as good as this. But as you can see, what has happened is we've got a recurring theme, and the theme is that women are vampires or something. I don't know. Anyway, he's had problems with women in the past, and it has come out in this series of pictures by Edvard Munch. Let me show you. This picture sold for $119 million. I know. Anything by Munch will cost you over $1 million. All of these pictures. Looks like something, a third grader could draw, right? Yeah, maybe. Okay. Not so hot. Okay. But yeah, his stuff is worth millions and millions of dollars. So he's one of the most famous artists in the world, as you can imagine. Anyway. And the woman is just sucking the life right out of him, isn't she? Obviously. And becoming dominant. This is really kind of interesting. This figure here becomes this figure, the middle figure in in this picture. And he keeps using the same figure over and over again. This figure of the individual, the male, is that figure. So we see the same figure over and over again. Really kind of fascinating. Anyway, Edvard Munch, one of my favorite artists. Of course, I'd love to have a picture that he painted, but you know, I only have a couple $1 million. I don't think I can afford it. So we're talking about projective personality tests. Once the most common form of psychological assessment, projective techniques are now employed less often than other forms of personality tests. The reliability, validity, and usefulness. Did you guys see exactly the same thing? Were you seeing women as negative figures in those series of paintings, and that the man shrinking? You didn't see the woman as. You didn't see that at all? You didn't see the woman as a negative figure?
I saw it as like empowerment.
She has a lot more power than he does.
Well, just that she was like not objective, but she just becoming who she wanted to be. And the man was kind of seemed like maybe the artist, in my opinion, is viewing it as a negative, but she was still becoming who she wanted.
Now you have to remember, Edvard Munch was painting until World War II. He died right after World War II. He lived for 80 years. He lived to be 80 years old. So we have to read the paintings from his era. Men were dominant, dominating, but of course we didn't see any dominant males in those paintings, did we? So we got to read things from his perspective. We have to read the paintings from his perspective. Does that make sense? Okay.
I think the woman had two men, so the men might have got disease. That's why.
Only if one man had a disease. That's a possibility. I don't know. That's why he kept shrinking, because he had well, that's a possibility. We couldn't treat syphilis until the 1930s. So maybe you're right.
I thought the same thing about the one where he was green.
He was green with jealousy, with envy. He tried to show emotion in the colors that he used. Amen.
Well, you know, one thing I was curious about, I noticed it was the theme of the red hair.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure, is that something Icelandic, or, you know, is it
Scandinavian? No, it's
Scandinavian, or I just, did it,
No, they're all-
meaning about the woman?
a lot of blonde.
Being a scarlet?
The scarlet woman. That's
Yeah.
a good point. I don't know. She had awfully red hair, and her hair kept getting tangled.
Oh yeah, no, it was getting freer and
Yeah.
wilder and wilder.
Wilder and wilder. I know, fascinating stuff, isn't it? Freeze of Life. You can look it up. It's Edvard Munch. One picture that I left out was one called The Death of Marat. Marat was a French politician during the French Revolution. He was killed by a prostitute who came over to, he hired a prostitute to come over, and after they were finished having sex, she murdered him. She killed him. And some people paint him in his bathtub, but Munch painted the two of them, or he's laying there on the bed dead with blood dripping down off the bed, and she's just standing there. So I didn't show you that picture. I thought that was a little bit too suggestive, since she killed the guy. Anyway, okay. What are we looking for in projective tests? The problem is reliability, validity, and usefulness of projective tests. It continues to be a topic of disagreement. It has to do with interpretation. I interpret things one way, you guys interpret it completely different. Of course, I read what it was supposed to be, how I was supposed to interpret those things. The first time I saw this was at the Chicago Museum of Modern Art, and it was in that series. It was actually in a longer series, but I didn't show you all the pictures. But it just knocked me out. I was just amazed. And of course, back then, you could buy a Munch for $100,000 instead of $1 million. So I didn't have $100,000 either. Anyway, it just really, I've always enjoyed Munch, and I think he's very descriptive in his paintings. Of course, if you don't like art, then or you don't like redheads, I don't know. Major problem with the psychometric quality of the projective techniques involves the open-ended instructed responses, unstructured responses that tests evoke. And so that's part of the problem as well. You have to interpret not only what they say, but you have to write all this down, and then you have to get somebody else to interpret it for you as well. And of course, if the two of you agree, then maybe you have something going on. Maybe that is the way it works. Personality inventories consist of a large number of statements to which the person is asked to respond in terms of fixed categories such as yes, no, or cannot say. One of the famous questions that isn't on the MMPI anymore is, would you rather be a forest ranger or a prostitute? You have to answer yes or no. You can't answer maybe. You have to answer yes or no. Forest ranger, prostitute. Forest ranger?
Yes.
Forest ranger? Forest ranger? Forest ranger? Forest ranger? Forest ranger? Forest ranger? Prostitute, forest ranger. Which one would you rather be? Forest ranger?
Oh, I've been a ranger already once, so.
So you're not going to be a prostitute? See how the other half? So I got one prostitute and everybody else is a forest ranger. Forest ranger, prostitute. Ranger? Forest ranger, prostitute. Prostitute?
Texas Ranger.
Prostitute.
Forest ranger, prostitute. Ranger? Ranger? There's a reason why they asked you that question. People that are forest rangers live by themselves out, and it's a very lonely existence. Prostitutes get to meet people all the time. So if you're more of an outgoing person, then you would say you'd rather. The last thing in the world you'd want to be is a forest ranger out in the middle of nowhere with nobody around. So if that's the reason they asked you that question, to see if you would rather be around people or not be around people. And that's the whole crux of the question.
So we should say prostitute?
You don't have to, you can say whatever you want. But if you say prostitute, it means that you would rather be around people, and you recognize the fact that you need to be around people.
That's funny, because it's like not where your mind goes.
Of course it does. Of course it does. And that's the whole idea, that you misinterpret what's going on.
Did they follow the question with why did you
No.
make so?
No. They just assume that anybody that would rather be a forest ranger is more is less outgoing than somebody that would rather be a prostitute. And usually in a class this size, I usually get a couple people that say prostitute. Usually it's a joke, but they usually say it anyway. But almost everybody wants to be a forest ranger. And I really would rather be a forest ranger. Where do I live? In the middle of a cornfield in Iowa. Okay. So I don't really need people, I guess. Whatever. Okay. Personality inventories are usually divided into various subscales to measure different aspects of the personality. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, is perhaps the most widely used personality inventory in the field of abnormal psychology. And I'll give you the reason in just a second. The MMPI was developed by Hathaway and McKinley in 1943, and it was revised as the MMPI-2 in 1989. One of the interesting things about the MMPI was that it was standardized using American Indians as one of their groups. Most of the personality inventories, there's not enough American Indians to even think about, so they standardize it using Caucasians and African Americans and Hispanics and other groups because they are more numerous. But because this was up in Minnesota, up in Minnesota where they have a lot of Chippewa and Sioux up there, they actually standardized it using American Indians. And it's one of the only tests where they used American Indians to standardize their tests. When the test was developed, it consists of 550 items covering a wide range of topics, including physical health, religious attitudes, moods, beliefs, fears, and social interests. When the test was developed, the items were administered to 8 groups of psychiatric patients with known diagnoses, such as hysteria, depression, and schizophrenia, and a controlled group of normals. And of course, American Indians were part of these, part of the abnormal group and the normal group. Yes?
What is the What does it stand for again? Minnesota personality?
Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. The Minnesota part's because it was done up in Minnesota. The multiphasic part is because there are 13 different phases that we're going to look at, and then it's a personality inventory.
Say it 3 times.
Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. MMPI. There's actually 3 tests. There's the old test, which was fairly racist. There's a new test that came out in 1989, and then they have a children's test. It's a lot shorter than the 550 questions. Subscales were then constructed for clusters of test items that distinguish each group, so that a person scoring high on the scale is essentially answering certain groups of questions in the same way as people with certain diagnoses. So you are forced to answer the question, would you rather be a prostitute or not actually anymore? They took that question out. But that's the reason I can talk about it. But one of the questions is, would you rather be a forest ranger or a prostitute? And what they're looking for, they were trying to find whether you were more outgoing or less outgoing.
Why did they take it out?
Why did they take it out? It was offensive to select individuals. I know. How silly are we anyway? So the 13 basic scales, there's 13 basic scales. Those are the multiphasic part. One of the scales is hypochondriasis. It shows abnormal concern with bodily functions. Depression is another one. For every scale, for every subscale, you'll get a score. And it's either a high score or a normal score. If it's a normal score, then you don't have that problem. If it's a high score, then you do have that problem. So if I was a hypochondriac, worried about my health all the time, then potentially I would score high on the hypochondriasis scale. If I was depressed, of course, I'd score high on the depression scale. Conversion hysteria has to do with clients, they're having physical or mental symptoms in a way to avoid conflicts or responsibilities. In other words, I'm ducking my job by malingering. Okay, and that's conversion hysteria. Psychopathic deviant is another one. It's repeated in gross disregard for social customs. Is psychopathic deviant. Masculinity, femininity, people with gender issues. Of course, in 1943, when they first wrote the test, homosexuality was against the law. It wasn't just a mental illness, it was against the law. And you could go to jail for being gay back then. Of course, not as important now as it once was. Paranoia is another scale. Psychoasthenia, it shows obsessions, guilt, compulsions, and abnormal fears. Schizophrenia shows bizarre, unusual thoughts and behaviors. Hypomania shows emotional excitement, overactivity, and flight of ideas. Social introversion shows shyness, insecurity, and little interest in others. In other words, that's the forest ranger in all of us, I guess, is the social introversion. There you go. And those are the 13 subscales. Okay. So for each one, you get a score, and it's either normal or it's abnormal, or it's abnormally high. So you're going to get a schizophrenia score whether you're schizophrenic or not. And it will tell, if it's high, it means you're probably schizophrenic. And if it's normal, then it means you're not. And you'll get a hypochondriasis, you'll get a paranoia scale. One of the things that we're seeing now is that the paranoia scale is getting higher and higher and higher in the United States. There's a lot of paranoid people out there. And they're all arming themselves with bump stocks and buying 18,000 rounds of ammunition, as bizarre as that may seem. Paranoia, there's a lot of paranoid people out there. And it's worse than it's ever been. None of you are old enough to remember this, but when I was young and going to college, it looked like we were going to erupt in Civil War. And it was going to be white people versus black people. The civil rights movement was out there. There were a lot of really strange things taking place in the United States. Riots on the East Coast in Newark, riots in Detroit, riots in Cincinnati, riots in Los Angeles, You know, all kinds of interesting things were taking place in the United States. It looked like we were going to have a civil war. People weren't as upset then as they are today over politics, over the bifurcation between conservative and liberal. It's worse now than it's ever been, than I've ever seen. Of course, I wasn't around before World War II. I had no idea what was going on then. But it looked like we were going to go into civil war. And so if you went to college in the 1960s or the 1970s, one of the things you had to decide is, what side am I going to fight for? What side am I going to be on? Of course, Vietnam was taking place at the same time. You had to decide. You had to decide lots of things, okay? But it was really an interesting time. The paranoia today is worse than it was back then. People are actually arming themselves, a bit like the crazy guy in Las Vegas. He had 17 guns at home, and he had, 29 in his hotel room with all those rounds of ammunition. Who thinks like that? Well, obviously he does. And like I said before, they've done an autopsy, and it came back normal. There's nothing wrong with that guy that we could see in the autopsy. Didn't have any tumors. They tested his brain function, and it seemed normal. He was tall. He was 6'1". If you're a short guy, of course, as Adler has told us, you have short man syndrome, and so you're angry all the time if you're a short man. But he was 6'1", he weighed 225 pounds, wasn't overweight. So what the hell was going on with him? Why did he blow away all those people in Las Vegas? We still don't have the answer, but we want the answer so that we can figure it out, so it doesn't happen again. Anyway. We didn't give him the MMPI. That might have been interesting if we'd given him the MMPI. Maybe if we had, we would have found out what he was so upset about. Maybe we could have found out that he was paranoid. Maybe we could have found out that, I don't know what we could have found out. Yes, sir.
Whatever turns out to him, or whatever was wrong with him, don't you think that it's not getting worse? It's always been here. It's just as the population grows, it becomes more and more.
As we get crowded, all that overcrowding, we just talked about that in high
It
class.
becomes more prevalent, and with the introduction of mass media, communication, we're aware a lot more aware of things that happen on the East Coast and the West Coast and in between. So before, I think we've always had crazy people. It's becoming a lot more.
Well, we didn't have crazy people that killed 59 people. We didn't have crazy people.
There's always been that.
Wounded 800 people.
There's always been that.
I don't know. We haven't seen that before.
There's always perspective. Like Che Guevara killed thousands of people, and he's hailed as a hero on one side, and he's hailed as a demon on another side. It's always perspective. There's always been there's always been mass murderers throughout history.
Potentially, but did Che Guevara ever kill 59 innocents, 58 innocents, I guess?
Yeah, he killed people for being homosexual. He killed a lot of people just for political.
He had a reason. This guy just shot all those people in Las Vegas. And we have no clue who he was targeting. Or maybe he hated people that listen to Thunder and Western. Change your channel tonight when you go home. Don't listen to country and western. You need to listen to hip hop. No, he went to another concert before that was a hip hop concert. So it couldn't have been the country and western.
Yeah, because he was staking out places, right?
Different places. He went to Boston and staked out a hip hop concert. So he was just targeting concerts. Maybe he hated people that liked loud music. I don't know. We'll never know. This is the problem. I don't know. I'd like to know, though. Because I want to make sure Chris doesn't go off on everybody. Here, I woke him up. I'm sorry, Chris. The MMPI-2 has become a standard component of personality assessment and psychological evaluations relating to such legal issues as child custody, likelihood to reoffend, competency to stand trial, and insanity. So we give everybody the MMPI. If you've got any kind of a problem, if you're in prison and we want to know if you're going to reoffend, if you're going to keep molesting children, we need to find that out. And we do that by giving you the MMPI. There are other batteries of tests that we will give you, but this is just one of the tests that we use to find out if you're lucid or not. if you're able to stand trial. If you're not able to stand trial, if you are insane, then one of the things that will happen to you is that we will put you in a mental hospital. And probably you'll never get out. Probably. Because we need to keep people from injuring other people. If we could, we would have stopped that guy from shooting 59 people. Well, he was the 59th person. And injuring 800, if we could have. We would have stopped that guy from shooting up the church in Texas, just north of San Antonio. We would have stopped that. And that's the Air Force's fault. They knew that that guy had a problem, and they didn't do anything about it. If you were reading the news today, they just released a list of 4,000 Army veterans who can no longer be allowed to have weapons. 4,000. The United States military just did that. Because they looked back over their records and they realized, this guy's whacked out, we better take his gun away from him. Just like the guy in San Antonio. So, the list just came out today. I don't think I'm on the list. I don't think my wife's on the list. I think we're both okay. But we don't have any weapons. The interpretation of the MMPI-2 is more structured than the interpretation of projective techniques, but it remains a complex activity with room for disagreement. A lot of people don't like the MMPI. They say it's racist. They say it's geared toward Western society, that Westerners are more likely to be normal than anybody else, so they don't like it. Many clinicians tend to use the MMPI in a rather loose fashion, drawing upon their past experience and clinical intuition to make inferences about personality dynamics and psychopathology from a particular profile. In other words, they're reading from their own experiences, and sometimes their own experiences aren't extensive enough for them to make these broad generalizations. Yes, sir.
Just a kind of a question about referring to this and other psychological values and maybe the law.
Correct.
I think, how do they draw the line with where something's wrong with someone? Because everybody gets mad at some point, and everybody has said something like, "I hate you," or "I wish you were dead," at some point in their life. But it doesn't mean we're all ready to go out and play something. So how do these tests? How do they draw the line?
Well, it depends on the state.
Well, it depends on the state.
Each state has their own criteria. Last Thursday, my son was walking across campus. He's a teacher down in South Florida. He was walking across campus and he saw a kid with his, I guess the style, I don't know if the style here is the same, but they pull their pants down below their butts. Do they do that here? So you can see all their underwear. Well, that's, on this campus you're not supposed to do that. And this kid was sleeping on the ground. He was asleep. Could have been drunk, could have been stoned, could have been anything. So my son, who was a teacher there, went up to the kid and he nudged the bottom of his foot to wake him up and tell him to pull his pants up and go home because it was after school. And the kid didn't wake up, so he left, and when he came back, the kid was still there. So he did it again. Nudged it for a little bit harder this time, and the kid woke up. And after using a lot of F words, fantastic. After using a lot of F words, the kid threatened to kill my son. Is it time?
Yes.
It is time. He threatened to kill my son. Not just him, but his father was going to come and kill him. His boys were going to come and kill him. So, yeah. I can't remember what my point was. It had something to do with threatening people. People threaten people all the time. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with my poor son. Not my poor son. He's like